The wagon rolled into town beneath a hard, gray sky. The sun hung low but gave no warmth, its pale light scattering across the rutted street. Dust lifted at every wheel turn, curling in the air like old smoke. The horses, ribs showing through their hides, clopped with a weary rhythm until the driver pulled them up before the saloon. He flicked his reins, more eager to be rid of his passenger than to rest the beasts. On the back plank of the wagon sat Margaret Hale. A shawl, thin and unraveling at the edges, clung about her shoulders. Her eyes, once bright as morning creek water, had grown dim from years of loss and sleepless nights. Her trunk, scuffed from too many journeys, lay beside her. A rocking chair was strapped across the rear, its arms worn smooth by hands that no longer carried her body but still longed for the rhythm of motion. She did not step down when the wagon stopped. She could not. The driver shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, and avoided her gaze. "End of the road, ma'am," he muttered. She reached for the edge of the wagon with frail hands, her fingers white-knuckled against the wood. The man hesitated, then hopped down and lifted her with a grunt. He set her gently onto the rocking chair, as if the chair itself were her body now. Then, without ceremony, he untied the trunk, set it down, and tipped his hat. "You'll find your way," he said, though the words held no conviction. A moment later, the wagon was gone, swallowed by dust and distance. Margaret sat in the street as the townsfolk gathered in the glow of lamplight. Women in calico skirts carried baskets from the mercantile, their voices sharp with gossip. Men leaned from the saloon door, smoke trailing from their lips. Children pointed before their mothers pulled them away. Whispers pricked her ears. "Widow Hale, that's her. Can't walk a step, they say. Best not to get involved. She'll drain what little a man's got." Margaret bowed her head, her hands fidgeting with a spindle of yarn she had carried since the accident. The motion steadied her heart, though the yarn would never be spun into cloth fine enough to buy favor. She had once been known, a rancher's wife with land and laughter and suppers lit by oil lamps bright as any star. Fever took her husband, misfortune took her legs, and silence took the rest. No one came forward to offer roof or bed. Faces turned, boots clicked away, and soon only the saloon light glared across her lap like false daylight. Hours stretched. The wind scoured the street, rattling the shutters and scattering dust against her shawl. The saloon door swung shut, leaving her in deepening darkness. For a moment she thought she might dissolve there, become nothing but an old shawl, a trunk, a rocking chair, and silence. Then a shadow moved. From the far end of the boardwalk came a man, shoulders broad beneath a faded coat. His step was slow, deliberate, and his face carried no expression but weariness carved deep. A scar cut across his jaw, not the kind earned in drunken scuffles, but the kind left by life's darker reckonings. His hands, when they hung by his sides, looked rough as split cedar. Hands that shaped wood, built beams, mended what was broken. He did not address her at first. He looked at the abandoned trunk, the rocking chair, then at the woman who sat like a relic among them. His eyes did not flinch or soften. "You've nowhere to go," he said simply, his voice low as the creak of old timber. Margaret felt her throat close. "It seems not." He studied her for a long moment, then lifted the trunk to his shoulder as though it weighed little. With his other arm he tilted the chair, careful not to jar her, and began to walk. The street was empty save for the sound of his boots on packed dirt and the steady rasp of the chair's legs sliding. Margaret clutched her shawl tighter, shame burning her cheeks. She had wanted someone to help, yet the reality of being carried off like helpless freight cut her pride raw. Still, there was no judgment in his silence. Only necessity. They left the town's lamps behind. The prairie stretched dark, with frost beginning to silver the weeds. Ahead, a small cabin waited at the edge of the cottonwoods, its windows glowing faintly with the promise of fire. The man set her trunk on the porch, carried her chair inside, and lowered her by the hearth. The room smelled of pine shavings and smoke. Tools lined the wall, planes, chisels, a saw hung neat as soldiers. A rifle rested across the mantel. Beside the hearth lay a half-finished cradle, its wood smoothed by careful hands. The man set a kettle on the hook above the fire, poured water, and busied himself without another word. Only when steam rose did he glance at her again. "You'll stay here," he said. Margaret swallowed. "I would not burden you." His scar pulled when he spoke again, but not in cruelty. "A burden is dead weight. You're still breathing. With that, he poured coffee into a tin cup, set it near her chair, and returned to carving a strip of wood as though the matter were finished. Margaret sat in silence, the warmth of the fire touching her face, the taste of coffee bitter but real on her tongue. The loneliness that had threatened to hollow her out shifted, though it did not leave entirely. She was still abandoned by the town, still paralyzed, still wrapped in a shawl too thin for the season. Yet one man, scarred, weathered, unknown, had lifted her from the dust and set her before his fire without asking anything in return. Her heart ached with shame and with safety in equal measure. That night, as the wind battered the shutters and the flames licked shadows across the beams, Margaret understood. The town had already buried her alive and forgotten. But Elias Turner, carpenter of little words and rough hands, had not. In his silence she found the faintest outline of dignity, thin as the thread she spun, yet strong enough to hold her through the dark. Morning came soft and colorless, a light snowfall dusting the prairie until the horizon blurred white against gray. Margaret woke to the smell of pine smoke and the sound of a knife moving steady against wood. The cabin was small, a single room with rafters blackened by years of fire. Shadows of old winters clung to the beams. Her chair creaked as she shifted, the sound brittle in the hush. Elias sat by the table, shoulders hunched, working a strip of cedar into shape. His hands moved with quiet patience, curls of wood gathering at his boots like shavings of pale ribbon. He glanced up only once, long enough to see she was awake, then set a tin cup of coffee within her reach. Not a word was spoken. The silence unsettled her at first, for she had grown used to townsfolk filling emptiness with either pity or judgment. But Elias's silence was different. It did not demand or dismiss. It allowed space for the weight of her own thoughts. Her eyes strayed to the trunk beside the hearth. Within it lay the remnants of her former life. Linens worn thin, a framed photograph of her husband with his hat tilted in boyish pride, and the folded wedding dress she could not bring herself to discard. She remembered the day she packed it, her fingers tracing the lace that once brushed a church aisle. A dress meant for a lifetime had instead become a grave marker for love and time. Her husband, Thomas Hale, had been a cattleman of broad shoulders and gentle words. Fever took him in a week, leaving her with land too large for her to keep and neighbors too eager to divide it. She sold the ranch, thinking at least her body still carried her forward. But the accident came soon after. A wagon jolted on a rut, a wheel broke, and she was thrown beneath. When she woke, her legs were no longer hers. Friends who once came daily drifted away, kindness thinning into excuses, then into absence. She thought of them as snowflakes against the window, falling bright for a moment, vanishing before they could hold. Her hand tightened on the shawl about her shoulders. She had believed her worth was measured by how much she could carry, how much she could labor. When her body betrayed her, the world closed its doors. Only the chair remained faithful, creaking beneath her as though to remind her she still existed. Elias's knife scraped against wood again, grounding her in the present. She studied him in secret. The scar that cut across his jaw gave him the look of a man who had faced violence and walked away, but not unchanged. His eyes, pale as winter sky, carried no malice. The cabin bore his mark. Tools of a settler, saws, hammers, planes, hung neat as scripture, while on the shelves small carvings spoke of another influence. A horse's head smoothed from aspen, a pattern of interlaced braids, a pipe stem inlaid with bone. She had heard whispers in town even before her abandonment, that Elias Turner had once lived among the Lakota, that he was neither trusted fully by settlers nor embraced by those who raised him. Men told the tale with suspicion, women with lowered voices as though his life were a scandal. Yet here beneath his roof the truth felt simpler. He was a man who had learned from many hands and carried their lessons in silence. Margaret reached for the coffee. Her fingers trembled, but the warmth steadied her. She dared to speak. "You ask me nothing." Elias did not look up from his carving. When a tree splits in the storm, you don't ask it why. You see the break and you leave it be until it finds its shape again. His words, plain as they were, struck deeper than she expected. For years she had been asked again and again to explain herself, as though the recounting of tragedy could justify her continued breath. Elias asked nothing. His silence was not indifference but mercy. Snow thickened outside, tapping softly at the window. The world beyond was blurred, yet inside the cabin every detail sharpened. The hiss of sap in the fire, the scent of resin, the steady rhythm of blade against wood. She found herself breathing slower, as though her body too could take root in this stillness. Her thoughts wandered back to Thomas. She remembered his laughter on cold mornings, the way his boots left prints in frost, the way his hand closed over hers when he promised she would never face a night alone. The fever had stolen him, but the loneliness afterward had hollowed her more completely. Even in her memories his image began to fade, edges blurred like the snow outside. Only the wedding dress remained crisp in her mind, a relic folded away untouched, a symbol of a promise time had broken. Margaret's gaze dropped to her lap, to her hands still capable of spinning yarn though her legs failed her. She whispered half to herself, "Dignity seems a hard thing to keep." Elias set down his knife and finally looked at her. His scar pulled faintly with the movement of his jaw. Dignity isn't lost when a body falters. It's lost when a soul bends to shame. His eyes lingered a moment, then he returned to his work. The words hung between them, heavier than silence, yet strangely comforting. Margaret let her eyes close for a moment, listening to the cabin breathe around her. She realized then that dignity could exist in stillness, that survival did not need to roar or stride. Sometimes it sat in a chair by the fire, holding a shawl tight, refusing to vanish, and perhaps Elias Turner, scarred carpenter, understood that more than most. The snow outside fell thicker, covering tracks, softening the land until all seemed equal beneath its weight. Within, two figures kept to their silence, each carrying shadows of the past, each learning that scars, whether carved in flesh or bound to wood, were not shame but proof of survival. The storm came without warning. By dusk the horizon had vanished, swallowed by a wall of gray that rolled over the prairie like a tide. Wind rattled the shutters and shoved against the cabin as though it meant to tear the walls apart. Snow hissed across the roof, sifted through every crack and howled in the chimney until the fire flared and guttered. Margaret sat wrapped in her shawl, her chair drawn close to the hearth. The rocking creak was drowned by the roar outside. Elias worked at the latch of the door, testing it, then settled back to the table with an air that suggested storms were old companions. But this night was different. A pounding knock shook the door, sharp and desperate, cutting through the storm's voice. Elias froze, his knife poised above a strip of wood. Margaret felt her heart leap to her throat. Few came this far from town after dark, and none in weather like this. The knock came again, harder. Elias rose, rifle in hand, and opened the door a crack. The wind shoved inside, carrying snow and a figure that stumbled against the threshold. A young man collapsed half into the cabin, a rifle slung across his back, blood darkening his sleeve. His breath came in ragged bursts, each one a cloud in the cold air. Elias caught him under the arms and dragged him in, shutting the door fast. The storm battered against it, but the latch held. The stranger was lean, his face drawn tight from hunger and pain. Dark hair fell across his brow, his skin carrying both settler pallor and the copper hue of Lakota blood. His eyes, when they lifted to Elias, showed recognition through the fevered haze. "Mr. Turner," he rasped. Margaret's chair creaked as she leaned forward. "You know him?" Elias lowered the boy onto a blanket by the fire. "I do." The young man winced as he shifted, clutching his arm. "They're after me. Say I stole horses." Margaret's heart tightened. The words sounded like a death sentence. She glanced at Elias, expecting him to send the boy away for their own safety. But Elias knelt beside the fire, his rough hands already reaching for cloth and water. "You'll stay," he said simply. Margaret's breath caught. If the townsmen are hunting him, Elias's eyes flicked to her, steady, unflinching. "The storm will kill him faster than they would." The fire cracked. Snow struck the windows like pebbles. Outside was a world that had no mercy. Inside, 3 souls sat in its defiance. Elias peeled back the boy's torn sleeve. The wound was deep, a bullet grazing the flesh near his shoulder. Blood had frozen stiff into his coat. Margaret turned her eyes away, but the sound of Elias pouring water over the wound made her wince as if it were her own. The boy gritted his teeth, his hand clutching the blanket. Elias worked without hurry, washing, binding, his movements deliberate as if every knot tied to the bandage was also a knot tied to the boy's life. Margaret saw in it a reflection of her first night there. Coffee set at her side, silence wrapped like a blanket, dignity restored without fanfare. The boy's eyes fluttered, heavy with exhaustion. "I never stole nothing," he muttered. Horse was mine since it was a colt, but they see me and all they see is what I ain't. Margaret felt the ache in his voice, half and half caught between worlds belonging to neither. She knew that exile, though in a different form. Her legs had failed her and the world had cast her aside. Elias wrung out the cloth, his jaw tight. You don't need to prove truth to men who've already chosen to lie. Margaret studied him. His words were not loud, not meant for persuasion or defense. They were carved, steady, like beams laid into the frame of a house meant to endure. She realized then that Elias lived by something deeper than charity. He did not abandon the unwanted, not because of pity, but because his soul would not permit it. The storm screamed around the cabin, rattling the walls as if to test them. Firelight flickered across the rafters, casting long shadows. Margaret sat still, her shawl drawn close, listening to the low murmur of Elias's voice as he guided the boy to drink water, to rest. The hush between their words carried more weight than the storm outside. For the first time, she wondered, had Elias taken her in not out of reluctant kindness, but because his code allowed no other choice? Her salvation was not a gift but a principle. The thought stung and soothed at once. The boy drifted into sleep, his breath evening, his face softened by firelight. Elias leaned back, his scar catching the glow. Margaret caught the tired bend in his shoulders, the years of labor and solitude that weighed on him. She rocked gently in her chair, the creak steady, the rhythm a small defiance against the storm. Snow piled higher against the door. The night deepened. Each hour stretched long. Margaret's eyes burned with fatigue, yet she could not look away from the scene before her. The carpenter, the wounded youth, the storm raging in judgment, and herself, rooted in a chair, spared from abandonment yet tethered to it still. When Elias finally spoke, his voice was low, roughened by the weight of memory. He came here once when he was small. I showed him how to carve a whistle from willow. His mother brought him proud as could be. Settlers scorned him. Lakota scorned him. He smiled just the same. Margaret let out a breath she did not know she held. She pictured the boy as a child, carrying both bloodlines like a burden and a gift, laughing despite the rejection of all. The storm pressed harder, rattling the cabin until it seemed the whole prairie meant to erase them. Yet the fire burned steady. Elias's hand stayed sure, and the boy still breathed. Margaret felt something stir inside her, a fragile thread of belonging, shared not through ease but through defiance against the cold. She looked at Elias, his profile stark in the firelight, and thought, perhaps mercy was not weakness, but strength of the rarest kind, and in that moment, she was no longer certain whether she owed her life to pity or to the unyielding justice that lived within this scarred carpenter. By the time the storm loosened its grip, the prairie had changed. Snow lay heavy across the land, pale as uncut cloth, muffling hoofbeats and footsteps alike. Yet rumors moved faster than wind. In town, men muttered that Elias Turner was harboring the half-breed fugitive. They spat tobacco into the snow and hitched rifles to their saddles. In a place where hunger ruled and justice bent easily, suspicion was as deadly as any blizzard. Margaret felt the shift long before she saw it. Riders began passing the cabin, their silhouettes etched against the horizon, rifles slung low across their horses. They did not stop, not yet. But the weight of their gaze pressed upon the small home like a shadow that lengthened each day. Inside, Elias sharpened his tools. The scrape of steel against whetstone cut the silence. His hands moved steady, unhurried, as though preparing wood instead of consequence. Then he lifted his old rifle, laid it across the mantel above the hearth, and cleaned it with slow precision. Margaret watched, dread hollowing her chest. She knew what it meant. Protection, in the end, was not only silence and shelter. It could demand blood. She sat in her chair, hands twisting in her lap, guilt rising sharp as bile. Her body could do nothing but sit and witness. When danger pressed near, she was no shield, no help, only weight. The rocking chair creaked, each sound reminding her of her limits, but Elias never spoke of weakness. When he set down the rifle, he crossed to her trunk and lifted a coil of rawhide from within. He set it gently across her lap. "Braid this," he said. "Strong cord will need it." Margaret blinked. "You trust me with this?" "You have hands. Use them," her throat tightened. It was no grand request, no gesture meant to soothe pride. It was simple inclusion, as natural as asking another to carry wood or pour water. She set to work, her fingers moving clumsy at first, then steadier. weaving the strands into strength. Each knot, each braid, each pull was a quiet rebellion against uselessness. The boy, his name was revealed now as Samuel, sat by the fire, his shoulder bound in fresh cloth. He watched her hands with the keen eyes of someone long accustomed to measuring worth. After a while he spoke, his voice low, carrying the weariness of years though he was still young. "Wherever I go, it is the same. To the Lakota, I am the settler's son. To the settlers, I am the Lakota's child. No fire welcomes me long." Margaret's hands slowed. She looked up, her heart aching. "I know that road," she said softly. "Not the same path, but the same stones. When I could walk, I had neighbors, friends, a place at every table. When I could not, doors closed, eyes looked away. It was as though my breath no longer counted." Samuel's gaze met hers, and for the first time his eyes softened. In that glance lay recognition. Rejection carried many faces, but its weight was the same. Elias sat listening, his knife still working wood, though his eyes flickered toward them. He spoke only once. "A home is not given by birth or by body. It is made by those who refuse to abandon one another." The words fell into the firelight, glowing brighter than flame. That night, the cabin no longer felt like mere refuge. The storm had bound them by necessity, but now something deeper began to stir. The fire burned warm. Margaret's braids coiled neatly beside her. Samuel's voice loosened enough to tell fragments of his childhood. How he had learned to track deer from his mother's kin. How he had mended fence rails with his father. How both halves of him were always considered lacking. Margaret shared, haltingly, memories of Thomas Hale, of the ranch that slipped through her fingers, of the accident that left her tied forever to the rocking chair. She did not often speak of it, yet here, in the company of two who carried scars of their own, the words came easier. Elias said little, but his silence held weight, not absence. Occasionally he added a word, a nod toward Samuel's skill with a knife, a quiet agreement with Margaret's memory. His presence was steady as oak beams, grounding them both. As the night deepened, Margaret felt the strangest thing, a thread of belonging. Not the belonging of ease nor of society's approval, but the belonging of three cast-offs who, by some providence, had found each other in the fire's circle. Her hands kept braiding. Her fingers grew sore, but she welcomed it, for the ache meant she still contributed. Each cord was a line tied not only to defense but to dignity. For the first time since her accident, she felt less like a burden and more like a companion. Outside, the riders circled again, their silhouettes glimpsed through the frost-laced window. Elias rose, checked the rifle, then returned to his seat without comment. The danger pressed close, but inside the cabin the fire burned steady, and three souls, abandoned by the world, held fast to one another. Margaret looked at her hands, rawhide braided strong, and thought, usefulness is not in legs or muscle, but in spirit, in witness, in refusing to fade. She had feared her life was over, but here, in a cabin battered by snow and suspicion, something like life began again. Dusk settled heavy over the prairie, the snow catching the last light until it glowed faint as embers across the land. The horizon darkened, and with it came the riders. Their torches flared in the gloom, orange tongues against the white drifts, a moving wall of fire and breath. The sound of hooves broke the hush, sharp and steady. Margaret gripped the arms of her rocking chair, her shawl pulled tight, though no cloth could guard against the chill that pierced her chest. Through the frost-laced window she counted them, half a dozen, perhaps more, rifles glinting beneath the flicker of flame. Their faces were hard with the resolve of men who believed themselves righteous. Elias stood at the door. He had set his tools aside, his rifle cradled across his arms. The firelight touched his scar, sharpening the lines of his jaw until he looked carved from the very timbers of the house. He did not pace nor tremble. He simply waited. Samuel, still weak but restless, rose from his blanket by the hearth. His hand moved toward his rifle, but Elias stopped him with a glance. "Not yet," he said, his voice as steady as oak beams. The riders dismounted, boots crunching in snow. The leader stepped forward, his torch lifting. "Turn him over, Turner. That boy's a thief and worse. You shelter him, you share his guilt." Elias opened the door wide, letting the cold rush in. He stood framed by firelight, rifle in hand, his figure tall against the dark. "The boy stole nothing," he said. "You're chasing blood, not justice." The man spat into the snow. "You calling us liars?" I'm saying you've chosen vengeance where none is owed. You want to hang him for who his mother was. That's not law. That's cowardice. The torches hissed in the wind. Men shifted uneasily, the weight of Elias's words pressing against them like unseen timber. Margaret felt the tension coil tighter, her pulse loud in her ears. Then the night cracked open. A shot rang out, sudden and wild. Samuel staggered, his good hand flying to his rifle. But before he could lift it, Elias moved. He stepped in front, shielding the boy, and the bullet tore into his arm. The torchlight flashed across the spray of blood. Margaret gasped, her chair jerking against the floorboards. The fire roared behind her, but it was the fire in her chest that nearly consumed her. She could not rise. Her legs were useless anchors. But her voice still lived. Enough, she cried, her words fierce as the wind itself. The riders froze, startled by the sound. Margaret sat framed in the glow of the hearth, her shawl falling loose, her frail form lit as though carved in flame. Her hair, streaked with gray, caught the light, and her eyes burned with a defiance that no paralysis could quench. "You shame yourselves," she said, her voice cutting through the cold. "A pack of armed men against a wounded boy. Against a man who has done nothing but stand for what is right. You call it justice? It is cowardice dressed in firelight." The silence that followed was deeper than the snowdrifts. The men shifted, uneasy. Some looked away. One lowered his torch, muttering. The leader's jaw tightened, but even he seemed unsettled by the sight of her. Frail, abandoned, yet unbroken, her spirit louder than their guns. One by one, the riders turned. Torches dimmed into the storm. Hooves clattered against the frozen ground, growing fainter until the night reclaimed them. The door closed with a heavy thud. Inside, silence fell, broken only by the hiss of the fire and Elias's rough breathing. Blood soaked his sleeve, dripping onto the floorboards. Samuel pressed cloth against the wound, his hands shaking. Margaret's chair creaked as she rocked forward. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched Elias's scarred jaw. His eyes, pale as winter sky, met hers. For the first time she saw not only strength but weariness, not only resolve but the faintest surrender. His hand lifted, covering hers, rough palm against her fragile fingers. The firelight flickered across them, binding scar to skin, burden to burden. No words were spoken, for none were needed. In that moment, Margaret felt the fire between them shift. No longer only danger and defiance, it became warmth. Fragile, undeniable, alive. She realized love could be kindled not in youth or ease, but in hardship, in survival, in the quiet bravery of refusing to abandon one another. Elias lowered himself into the chair across from her, his wound bound tight. Samuel sat near the hearth, silent, his eyes heavy with gratitude. Outside, the snow covered the riders' tracks, erasing their fury as though it had never been. Inside, the three of them sat in the glow of firelight, scarred yet still breathing. Margaret's shawl slipped from her shoulders, forgotten. For the first time in years, she did not pull it close for comfort. She no longer needed to. The warmth came not from cloth, but from the presence of those who chose to remain. Morning broke clean and cold. The storm washed away by a sky of glass-blue clarity. The snow, undisturbed, glittered like fields of crushed crystal beneath the rising sun. Smoke lifted from the chimney in a thin gray column, steady against the bright air. Samuel stood by the doorway, saddlebag slung across his good shoulder. His wound was bound, his strength not yet whole, but his eyes carried the restless fire of youth. He would not remain. The prairie was too wide, the grudges too near. His path led outward into uncertainty. Elias pressed a parcel into his hand. Dried meat, a loaf of coarse bread, a coil of rope freshly braided by Margaret's fingers. "It'll hold," Elias said simply. The boy hesitated, gaze flicking between the man who had once taught him to shape wood and the woman who had defended him with nothing but her voice. He lowered his head in something like reverence. "I'll remember," he said, though his words carried the ache of someone unsure where memory would find a home. Margaret lifted a hand from her chair. "Remember that you are more than what others name you," she told him. "You belong to the earth itself, not to their judgment." Samuel's eyes softened. Then, without further word, he mounted his thin horse and turned toward the horizon. Snow muffled the hoofbeats as he rode, shrinking to a dark figure against the vast whiteness until he was only a speck, then nothing at all. Margaret watched long after he vanished, her hands folded in her lap. A strange ache filled her chest, not sorrow, not joy, but the solemn weight of seeing a seed cast to wind. She prayed silently it would find soil somewhere and grow. The days that followed carried a change, quiet yet undeniable. At first it was only a sack of grain left at Elias's gate. No note, no hand seen. Then came scraps of cloth, a small pouch of coffee beans, a bundle of candles. Each offering spoke of the town's uneasy conscience. They had turned their backs on Margaret once, had stood idle while Elias risked his life. Now shame pressed upon them like frost on window panes, and this was their fumbling reparation. Elias never spoke of it. He merely carried the gifts inside, setting them on shelves with the same care he gave to his tools. But Margaret felt each gesture keenly. The same townsfolk who once saw her as a burden now regarded her with something like respect, not for her body, which remained frail, but for the fire she had shown in that doorway. She was no longer invisible, yet it was not the townsfolk's offerings that rooted her to life again. It was the rhythm of days in Elias's cabin, the scrape of his saw, the hiss of coffee boiling, the glow of firelight across wood and shawl. The house no longer felt like a refuge borrowed, but a place she belonged. One morning, when the snow lay fresh and blue shadows stretched long across the prairie, Elias wheeled her chair onto the porch. The boards creaked under their weight and the air bit sharp against her cheeks. He set another chair beside her, not her rocker but his own, worn smooth by years. They sat together in silence, tin cups of coffee steaming in their hands. The prairie lay endless before them, white and bright beneath the sun. Crows wheeled overhead, their wings black strokes against the sky. The rocking chairs moved slowly in unison, wood creaking like an old hymn. Margaret's shawl tugged in the wind, and Elias reached across, steadying it without a word. His hand lingered a moment, rough warmth brushing hers before returning to his cup. They did not need speech. The silence carried more weight than words could hold. It was not the silence of abandonment, nor the silence of suspicion. It was the silence of companionship. Two souls who had walked through fire and come out tempered, scarred yet sound. Margaret looked at Elias, at the scar that curved his jaw, at the strength that had borne both her and Samuel through the storm. For the first time she saw not only the carpenter, but the man beneath, the one who had chosen compassion when indifference would have cost him nothing. Her own reflection returned to her. She was no longer the widow abandoned at the edge of town, waiting for pity or death. She was a woman still alive, still capable of dignity, of witness, of love that burned steady even in winter. The prairie wind carried their breath into the open air. The fire inside the cabin had burned down to embers, but on the porch another fire endured, one that required no flame. Margaret's chair rocked gently beside Elias's. The sound of wood on wood was soft, steady, timeless. And in that quiet she understood. Survival after rejection was not mere endurance. It was the birth of something unexpected, connection, partnership, the slow and patient bloom of love in a season where she thought nothing could grow. The day stretched wide before them, the horizon bright and unbroken. The rocking chairs kept time. The silence was no longer loneliness. It was home.